On a Tuesday morning in July 2009, a lawyer stood before a Los Angeles Superior Court judge, holding two documents. One was dated July 7, 2002. The other was supposedly signed the same day. Both carried Michael Jackson's signature. Both claimed to be his last will and testament, and both would determine the fate of a fortune that stretched far beyond what anyone in that courtroom could have imagined. The problem wasn't which document was real. The problem was what neither document said. Michael Jackson had been dead for exactly 2 weeks. The world was still reeling. Fans gathered outside the courthouse in tribute shirts and handwritten signs. Inside, attorneys in expensive suits shuffled papers and avoided eye contact with the family members seated in the gallery. Katherine Jackson, 79 years old, sat with her hands folded in her lap. Her sons, children Prince, Paris, and Blanket were being cared for elsewhere, shielded from the chaos that was already beginning to consume the estate they'd just inherited. But what they'd inherited wasn't just money. It was questions, mountains of them. And in the years that followed, those questions would multiply into something darker, a labyrinth of control, manipulation, and wealth that seemed to benefit everyone except the people Michael Jackson claimed to love most. This is the story of an inheritance that looked perfect on paper and became a nightmare in practice. Michael Joseph Jackson died on June 25, 2009, at the age of 50. The cause of death was acute propofol intoxication, administered by his personal physician, Dr. Conrad Maury, who would later be convicted of involuntary manslaughter. But the day Michael died, the immediate concern wasn't how he died. It was what he left behind. At the time of his death, Michael Jackson's financial situation was catastrophic. He owed hundreds of millions of dollars. His Neverland Ranch was in foreclosure. He hadn't toured in years. He was preparing for a comeback series of 50 concerts in London called This Is It. But those shows were still months away, and many doubted he'd be able to perform them. Publicly, he was broke. Privately, he owned something far more valuable than cash. He owned half of Sony, a TV music publishing, a catalog that included the rights to nearly every Beatles song ever written, along with thousands of other tracks. That catalog alone was worth somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion, depending on who you asked. He also owned his own master recordings, his image, his name, and the Neverland property itself, despite the debt attached to it. Michael had 3 children. Prince Michael, born in 1997. Paris Michael Catherine, born in 1998. And Prince Michael II, known as Blanket, born in 2002. Their mother or mothers remained a subject of speculation, but legally, Michael was their sole parent. He'd raised them in seclusion, often covering their faces with masks or veils when they appeared in public. He homeschooled them. He controlled every aspect of their lives, and in his will, he made it clear they were to inherit everything, except they didn't. Not exactly. Michael's will, presented to the court by attorney John Branca, named 3 beneficiaries. His 3 children, his mother Catherine, and various charities. The children were to receive the bulk of the estate once they reached adulthood. Catherine would receive a lifetime stipend in custody of the children. The charities would receive 20%, but the will didn't give the children control. It gave control to 2 men Michael had hired years earlier, John Branca, his attorney, and John McClane, a music executive. They were named co-executors, with full authority to manage, invest, and grow the estate indefinitely. The children would inherit the money, but Branca and McClane would decide how it was spent, how it was invested, and when or if the children ever saw a dime. Katherine Jackson's lawyer stood up during that first hearing and said something that would echo for years. "We don't dispute the will. "We dispute the execution." The judge nodded and scheduled another hearing. No one realized it yet, but the battle had already begun. To understand what happened to Michael Jackson's inheritance, you have to understand who Michael Jackson was before he died. Not the performer, not the icon, the man. By 2009, Michael had lived most of his life under someone else's control. As a child, his father, Joe Jackson, managed the Jackson 5 with an iron fist, controlling their money, their schedule, and their lives. Michael spoke later about being terrified of his father, about rehearsals that lasted until he collapsed, about beatings if he missed a step. He earned millions as a child. He saw almost none of it. When he became an adult, he hired managers, lawyers, and advisors to handle his affairs. He trusted them because he didn't trust himself with money. He'd grown up watching his father lose fortunes through bad deals and mismanagement. Michael overcompensated by delegating everything. He signed documents he didn't read. He agreed to contracts he didn't understand. He surrounded himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear. John Branca entered Michael's life in 1980. He was a young entertainment lawyer with a growing reputation. He negotiated Michael's deal with Epic Records. He structured the purchase of the ATV catalog The Beatles songs in 1985, the deal that would make Michael hundreds of millions. Branca was smart, aggressive, and loyal. Michael trusted him. But in 2006, Michael fired him. The reasons were never made fully public, but people close to Michael said he'd begun to suspect Branca of self-dealing, of making decisions that benefited Branca's other clients more than they benefited Michael. There were whispers of contracts signed without Michael's knowledge, of percentages that didn't add up. Michael cut ties and brought in new advisors, except the will that surfaced after Michael's death was dated 2002, when Branca was still in Michael's employ and had named Branca as executor, which meant that even though Michael had fired him, Branca was now back in control. Permanently. John McClane was different. He was a music executive, a hitmaker, someone Michael had known since childhood. He'd worked with Janet Jackson, Quincy Jones, and dozens of other major artists. He was family in a way Branca never was, but he was also someone who stood to profit enormously from managing Michael's catalog, from deciding which songs got released, which deals got made, which projects moved forward. Catherine Jackson didn't object to the will itself, but she asked the court a simple question. Why were two men she barely knew given complete control over her son's estate, including the financial future of his children, when she, as mother, the woman raising his kids, had no say whatsoever? The court's answer was blunt. Because that's what the will said. In the months after Michael's death, the estate began to transform. Branca and McClane moved quickly. They renegotiated debts. They brokered a deal with Sony for a posthumous album and a concert film based on the This Is It rehearsal footage. The film grossed over $260 million worldwide. The album went platinum. Suddenly, the estate that had been drowning in debt was generating massive cash flow. By the end of 2010, the estate had earned over $1 billion. It paid off Michael's most pressing debts and began investing in long-term ventures. Branca and McClane were lauded in the press as financial saviors, men who'd rescued Michael's legacy from ruin. But Catherine Jackson's legal team started asking uncomfortable questions. Where was the money going? The children were receiving an allowance, reportedly $80,000 a month for all three of them, plus housing and expenses. Catherine received a stipend as well, but that was a fraction of what the estate was earning. The rest, according to the executors, was being reinvested. Into what? That's where things got murky. The estate's financial disclosures were filed with the court, but they were heavily redacted. Specific deals were marked confidential. Investment strategies were labeled proprietary. The public and Even some members of the Jackson family had no idea what Branca and McLean were actually doing with the money. And there was another issue. The executors were entitled to compensation. The will specified that they could take a percentage of the estate's gross income as payment for their services. By 2012, Branca and McLean had collectively earned tens of millions of dollars in executor fees. They would go on to earn hundreds of millions over the next decade. Catherine's attorneys argued that the fees were excessive, that the executors were enriching themselves at the expense of the beneficiaries. Branca and McLean responded that their compensation was justified by the estate's extraordinary growth. Without them, they said, there would be no estate to fight over. The court sided with the executors again. But the family wasn't done. If stories like this pull you in, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. In 2012, several members of the Jackson family staged what the media called a coup. Janet Jackson, Randy Jackson, Hermine Jackson, and Robbie Jackson signed a letter demanding that Branca and McLean be removed as They claimed the will was fraudulent, that Michael's signature had been forged, and that the executors were systematically looting the estate. The letter cited specific evidence. The will was dated July 7, 2002, and stated it had been signed in Los Angeles. But according to travel records and eyewitness accounts, Michael Jackson was in New York City on July 7, 2002. He was seen at a hotel. He attended meetings. There were photographs. If the will said he signed it in Los Angeles, and he was provably in New York, then the will was a fake. Branca's legal team countered with their own evidence. They produced affidavits from the witnesses who'd been present at the signing, including one from a lawyer who swore under oath that he'd watched Michael sign the document in a Los Angeles office. They argued that the travel records were unreliable, that Michael could have flown back and forth in a single day, that memories were faulty. The court examined the evidence and ruled that the will was valid, but the ruling didn't eliminate the doubts. It just silenced them legally. The family split. Catherine Jackson, caught in the middle, initially supported her children's challenge, but later withdrew her objection. Some speculated she'd been pressured by the executors who controlled her stipend. Others believed she simply wanted peace. Either way, the challenge collapsed. But the questions remained. If the will was real, why were there so many inconsistencies? If it was fake, why would Branca and McLean risk their careers and reputations on a forgery? And if Michael really wanted them in control, why had he fired Branca 4 years before he died? No one had good answers, and the estate moved forward. By 2015, the estate's earnings had surpassed $2 billion. Branca and McLean had negotiated deals with Sony, Cirque du Soleil, and other major corporations. There were Las Vegas shows, tribute albums, licensing agreements, and a steady stream of posthumous releases. Michael Jackson was more profitable dead than he'd been in the last decade of his life. The children were growing up. Prince was 18. Paris was 17. Blanket was 13. Under the terms of the will, Prince would begin receiving distributions from the estate once he turned 18. With full access to his share at 30, Paris and Blanket would follow the same schedule. But full access didn't mean what it sounded like. Even at 30, the children wouldn't control the estate. The executors would remain in power indefinitely, managing the assets and distributing income according to their discretion. The children would be beneficiaries, but not owners, not decisioned. Makers. Paris Jackson began speaking publicly about her frustration. In interviews, she described feeling disconnected from her father's legacy, shut out of decisions about how his music and image were used. She wanted to be involved. She wanted a voice. But the executors didn't answer to her. They answered to the court, and the court continued to side with them. There were other issues too. The estate had been paying Catherine Jackson's expenses for years, including the mortgage on a mansion in Calabasas, where she lived with several of Michael's siblings. But in 2017, the executors began pushing back. They argued that Catherine's expenses had grown excessive, that she was supporting extended family members who weren't entitled to estate funds, and that the costs needed to be reined in. Catherine's attorneys fired back. They pointed out that the executors were earning millions in fees, while nickel-and-diming an elderly woman who'd lost her son and was raising his children. The optics were brutal. The court brokered a compromise. Catherine's allowance was adjusted, but the broader issue who really controlled Michael's money, and whether that control was being exercised in the beneficiary's best interests remained unresolved. In 2016, something strange surfaced. A lawyer named Howard Weitzman, who'd represented the estate, quietly left his position. He didn't give a public reason, but around the same time, documents began circulating among Jackson family members suggesting that the estate had been involved in deals that directly benefited Branca's other clients. One example stood out. The estate had agreed to a joint venture with Sony that gave Sony expanded rights to Michael's master recordings in exchange for a massive upfront payment. The deal was worth hundreds of millions. It was one of the largest music catalog deals in history. But buried in the fine print was a clause that allowed Sony to acquire certain assets at below-market rates if the estate ever decided to sell. Critics argued that this gave Sony a company Branca had represented 4 years of sweetheart deal at the estate's expense. Branca's team denied any conflict of interest. They said the deal was vetted by independent advisors, approved by the court, and structured to maximize value for the estate. But the fact remained. Branca had deep ties to Sony. He'd negotiated deals for them before, and now he was negotiating deals on behalf of an estate that owned assets Sony desperately wanted. It was legal. It might have even been smart business, but it looked bad. And it raised a larger question. Were the executors managing the estate for the beneficiaries, or were they managing it for themselves and their allies? The deeper you looked into Michael Jackson's estate, the stranger it became. Not strange in a scandalous way. Strange in a structural way. The estate functioned less like a family inheritance and more like a highly profitable corporation with 2 CEOs who couldn't be fired, shareholders who had no voting rights, and a board of directors that didn't exist. By 2018, the estate was generating between $60 and $80 million a year in gross income. Most of that came from music royalties, licensing deals, and the Cirque du Soleil shows. A smaller, but still significant portion came from merchandise, video games, and other ventures. After expenses and executor fees, the beneficiaries Catherine and the 3 children were receiving distributions in the range of $30 to $40 million annually, divided among them. On paper, that sounds like a fortune. And it is, but set against the estate's total earnings, it represented less than half of the gross income. The rest was going to overhead, investments, legal fees, and executor compensation. And there was no end date. The executors would remain in control as long as the estate existed, which, given the structure of the trusts Michael had set up, could be decades. Potentially forever. Catherine Jackson was in her late 80s. She wouldn't live forever when c'est dit. Her stipend would end. The children would continue receiving their distributions, but they still wouldn't control the estate. Branca and McLean would. Or their successors, whoever they appointed. Paris Jackson gave an interview in 2019 where she said something striking. She said she loved her father's music, but she didn't feel like it belonged to her. She felt like it belonged to a corporation. She said she'd tried to get involved with the estate to learn how it worked, to have input on how her father was represented. But she'd been shut out, not maliciously, just systematically. There was no role for her. The structure didn't allow it. Prince Michael Jackson was more diplomatic, but he echoed similar sentiments. He said he trusted the executors. He believed they were doing a good job, but he also said he wished there was more transparency, more communication, more opportunity for the family to be involved. Blanket, the youngest, stayed silent. Then, in 2020, something unexpected happened. The estate released a statement announcing that it had sold half of Michael's stake in the Sony TV catalog to Sony for $750 million. The deal shocked the industry. The catalog was the crown jewel of Michael's assets. It was the thing he'd fought to keep during his financial troubles. The asset he'd refused to sell even when creditors were circling. And now, just over a decade after his death, the executors had sold half of it. The estate statement framed the sale as a strategic move. They said the deal eliminated debt, provided liquidity for future investments, and positioned the estate for long-term growth. Financial analysts praised the decision. Sony got what it wanted. The estate got cash. Everyone won, except the family wasn't consulted. At least, not meaningfully. Catherine Jackson's attorneys issued a terse statement saying she'd been informed of the sale. Paris and Prince said nothing publicly, but sources close to them suggested they were blindsided. The sale wasn't illegal. The executors had the authority to make it. The will gave them broad discretion to buy, sell, and manage assets as they saw fit. But it highlighted the central tension that had plagued the estate since day one. The beneficiaries had no power. They could receive money, but they couldn't shape the legacy. They couldn't protect the assets. They couldn't even say no. And there was another wrinkle. The sale meant that Sony now owned a majority stake in the catalog. Michael had spent decades fighting Sony, accusing them of exploiting artists, calling them manipulative and greedy. He'd even protested publicly, holding up signs that said Sony kills music. He'd wanted his children to inherit the catalog so they could take it back, so they could control the Beatles' music and his own masters and build something independent. Now, and Michael's children had cash instead. Whether that was the right decision financially is debatable. Whether it honored Michael's wishes is another question entirely. There's a legal term that gets used a lot in estate law: fiduciary duty. It means that executors are required to act in the best interests of the beneficiaries, not themselves. If an executor profits from a deal at the beneficiary's expense, or if they make decisions that benefit third parties over the people they're supposed to represent, they can be held liable. But proving a breach of fiduciary duty is extraordinarily difficult. You have to show that the executor acted with malice or gross negligence. You have to prove that they knew they were harming the beneficiaries and did it anyway. In most cases, as long as the executor can point to a plausible business rationale, the courts will defer to their judgment. That's what happened with Michael Jackson's estate. Every time the family raised concerns, the executors provided a rationale. Every time there was a question about a deal, they showed that it had been vetted by lawyers, accountants, and advisors. Every time the court reviewed their actions, it found that they'd acted within their authority. But authority isn't the same as wisdom, and legality isn't the same as morality. The executors did grow the estate. They turned a financial disaster into a billion-dollar empire. They paid off debts, generated income, and ensured that Michael's children would never want for money. But they also centralized control in a way that made the beneficiaries dependent. They structured deals that benefited powerful corporations. They enriched themselves through fees that dwarfed what most executors earn. And they did all of this while operating behind a veil of confidentiality that made accountability nearly impossible. By 2021, Tensions within the family had reached a breaking point. Not between the children and the executors, at least not publicly, but within the extended Jackson family. Several of Michael's siblings had filed lawsuits over the years, claiming they were entitled to portions of the estate or challenging specific deals. All of those lawsuits had been dismissed, but the resentment lingered. Randy Jackson gave an interview where he accused Bronca and McLean of manipulating Catherine, of isolating her from her other children, and of using her as a pawn to legitimize their control. He said the executors had turned the estate into a money machine that served everyone except the people Michael loved. Janet Jackson stayed mostly quiet, but she let it be known that she supported her siblings. She didn't challenge the will directly, but she made it clear she believed something was wrong. Catherine, caught in the middle, issued a statement through her attorneys, saying she had no issues with the executors and asking her children to stop fighting. Whether that reflected her true feelings, or whether it was something her lawyers told her to say, is impossible to know. Meanwhile, the estate continued to thrive. New deals were announced. A Broadway musical was in development. Streaming numbers were up. Michael Jackson remained one of the highest-earning deceased celebrities in the world, year after year, and the executives remained in control. There's a document that didn't get much attention at the time, but became important later. It was a letter Michael Jackson wrote in 2003, a year after the will was supposedly signed. In Teleter, Michael expressed frustration with his business affairs. He said he felt surrounded by people who didn't have his best interests at heart. He said he wanted more control, more transparency, more involvement in the decisions that affected his life and his children's future. The letter was never acted on. Michael didn't change his will. He didn't fire his executors. He didn't restructure his estate. And then, 6 years later, he died. Some people argue that the letter proves Michael was unhappy with Bronca and McLean, that he would have replaced them if he'd lived. Others argue that it's just a moment of frustration, the kind of complaint any wealthy person might make about their advisors, and that it doesn't reflect Michael's actual intentions. But the letter raises a haunting possibility. What if Michael didn't know what was in his will? What if he signed documents without reading them, trusting that the people around him had his best interests at heart? What if the structure that now controls his estate, irrevocable trust, the lifetime executorship, the lack of family oversight wasn't something he carefully planned, but something he stumbled into because he didn't understand what he was signing? There's no way to know. Michael is gone. The people who were in the room when he signed the will have given sworn testimony. But testimony is just words. The truth die with. Michael and his children are left to inherit a fortune they can't control, managed by men they didn't choose, under terms they can't change. In 2023, Prince Michael Jackson turned 26. Under the terms of the trust, he was eligible to receive a larger distribution. The exact amount wasn't made public, but estimates put it somewhere in the range of tens of millions of dollars. It was life-changing money. Generational wealth. But it wasn't freedom. Prince couldn't decide how the estate invested its assets. He couldn't influence which deals got made or which projects moved forward. He couldn't even access the full financial records to see exactly how much the estate was worth or where the money was going. Those decisions remained with the Paris was 25. She'd built a career as a model and musician, trying to establish herself outside of her father's shadow. She'd spoken openly about her struggles with mental health, about the pressure of being Michael Jackson's daughter, about the feeling of being owned by a legacy she didn't create. In interviews, she was asked about the estate. She was careful with her words. She said she was grateful for the financial security. She said she respected but there was always a hesitation, a pause before she answered, a sense that there was more she wanted to say, but couldn't. Blanket, now 21, and going by the name Biggie, stayed almost entirely out of the public eye. He gave no interviews. He made no statements. He lived quietly in the Calabasas mansion with his grandmother, a ghost in his own inheritance. The estate's tax filings from 2022, the most recent available, showed gross income of just over $70 million. Executive fees for that year totaled nearly $8 million. Legal and administrative costs added another $12 million. After distributions to the beneficiaries and charitable contributions, the estate retained approximately $15 million for reinvestment. Those numbers tell a story. They show an estate that's functioning, that's profitable, that's meeting its legal obligations. But they also show an estate where the executors are earning more annually than most people will make in a lifetime, where administrative costs consume a significant portion of the income, and where the beneficiaries receive less than half of what the estate generates. Is that wrong? Legally, no. The executors are entitled to their fees. The costs are justified by the complexity of managing a global brand. The reinvestment is sound financial planning. But is it what Michael Jackson wanted? Did he envision a future where his children would be wealthy but powerless, where men he'd fired would control his legacy, where some other company he despised would own his music? The only person who could answer that is dead. There's a quieter tragedy in all of this, one that doesn't get talked about as much. Katherine Jackson is 94 years old. She raised Michael. She raised his children after he died. She's watched her son's estate become a billion-dollar empire, watched lawyers and executives argue over money and contracts, watched her family fracture under the weight of an inheritance that was supposed to provide security, and she's powerless too. She can't change the will. She can't remove the executors. She can't protect her grandchildren from a system that treats them as beneficiaries rather than heirs. She can ask questions. She can raise concerns. But in the end, she has no authority. When say this, and given her age, that day isn't far off. Her stipend will end. The mansion will likely be sold or repurposed. Her role in the estate will be erased, and the executors will continue managing Michael's legacy for another generation, or two, or three, until the trusts eventually dissolve or the money runs out, which, given the estate's earning power, might never happen. In 2024, a financial analyst published a report estimating the total value of Michael Jackson's estate at approximately $2.1 billion. That included the remaining stake in the music catalog, the master recordings, the image rights, the real estate, and various other assets. It made Michael one of the wealthiest deceased celebrities in history. But that wealth is locked inside a structure that no one can dismantle. The executives control it. The courts oversee it. The beneficiaries receive distributions from it, but no one owns it. Not really. It's a machine, and machines don't care about family. They don't care about legacy Tehusdrun. There's a question that gets asked a lot in legal circles, especially among estate planning attorneys who study high-profile cases like Michael Jackson's. The question is simple. What's the point of leaving your children a fortune if you don't give them the power to use it? Michael Jackson's will was designed to protect his children. It created trusts that ensured they'd never be broke, never be exploited, never lose everything the way he almost did. It appointed executors who were competent, experienced, and motivated to grow the estate, but it also stripped those children of agency. It turned them it made them beneficiaries of a system they couldn't influence, controlled by people they didn't choose, operating under rules they couldn't change. And that raises a darker question. Was the will designed to protect Michael's children, or to protect the estate from Michael's children? Because the structure ensures that the estate will never be mismanaged by inexperienced heirs. It ensures that the money will be invested wisely, that the brand will be protected, that the assets will grow. But it also ensures that the people Michael loved most will never have real control over what he left behind. They'll be rich, but they won't be free. Paris Jackson said something in an interview a few years ago that stuck with people. She said her father used to tell her that the most important thing in life was to be yourself, to make your own choices, to never let anyone control you. And then he left her an inheritance that does exactly that. Maybe he didn't realize what he was signing. Maybe he trusted the wrong people. Maybe he thought he had more time to fix it. Or maybe he knew exactly what he was doing, and he decided that financial security mattered more than autonomy. There's no way to know, but the result is the same. Michael Jackson's children are wealthy beyond measure, and they're trapped. The estate continues. Deals are made. Money is earned. The executors file their reports. The court approves them. The beneficiaries receive their distributions, and the machine keeps running. John Branca is in his 70s now. John McClane is in his 60s. At some point, they'll retire or die. The will allows them to appoint successors, people who will step into their roles and continue managing the estate with the same authority they've had. Michael's children won't get to choose those successors. The court might review the appointments, but it won't have much say. The structure is self-perpetuating. The executors choose the next executors, who choose the next ones. On and on, potentially forever. And the Jacksons, Michael's mother, his children, his siblings will continue to watch from the outside, beneficiaries of a legacy they can't touch. There are people who defend the estate. They point to the money, the growth, the deals. They say Branca and McClane saved Michael's legacy, that without them the estate would have been looted by creditors and mismanaged by family members. They say the children are lucky, that they're receiving millions of dollars without having to work for it, that they should be grateful. And maybe they're right. Maybe the executors are heroes. Maybe the system works, but there are others who look at the same facts and see something different. They see a will signed under questionable circumstances, granting unchecked power to two men who profit enormously from that power. They see a family shut out of decisions, beneficiaries treated like shareholders in a corporation they can't influence. They see an estate that earns billions but distributes millions, with the difference swallowed by fees, costs, and reinvestments that benefit everyone except the people it's supposed to serve. And they wonder, is this really what Michael Jackson wanted? Or is this what the people around him wanted? On the 10th anniversary of Michael Jackson's death, his children released a joint statement. It was brief. They thanked the fans for their support. They said they were proud of their father's legacy. They said they were committed to honoring his memory. They didn't mention the estate. They didn't mention the executors. They didn't mention the inheritance. But the silence said everything. Michael Jackson's estate is a success by every financial metric. It's generated billions of dollars. It's paid off debts. It's made Michael's children wealthy. It's preserved his music for future generations. But it's also a cautionary tale. A reminder that wealth without control is just another form of dependence, that an inheritance, no matter how large, can become a cage if it's designed the wrong way. Michael Jackson spent his life trying to escape people who controlled him. His father, his managers, his record labels. He fought for independence, for ownership, for the right to make his own choices. And then he signed a will that put his children right back where he started. Maybe that's the real nightmare. Not that the inheritance went wrong, but that it went exactly the way it was designed to. And no one can do anything about it. Catherine Jackson still lives in the mansion in Calabasas. She's there with Biggie, who rarely leaves the house. Paris visits when she can. Prince has his own life now, his own projects, his own identity separate from his father. They're a family, but they're also strangers to the machine that controls their wealth. They get statements. They receive distributions. They hear about deals after they're made, and they move forward day by day, living in the shadow of a fortune they'll never truly own. The estate will outlive them. It will outlive everyone who knew Michael Jackson personally. And somewhere in a vault in Los Angeles, AWOL signed on July 7, 2002, or maybe it wasn't, continues to dictate the future of a family that had no say in writing it. That's the inheritance Michael Jackson left behind. Not just money, but questions, doubts, and a system that no one can stop, not even his children.